Okay, so for our interview, we interviewed Philip Doherty on his direction of a play at the park. For getting in contact, Noelle knew him, so
Um, I was assigned the role as production manager for the video production project, and I knew Philip from working with him on The Begrudgers, which was his Storyland contribution, and he won it that year. So I knew he was a good director and writer of plays, and he always has something going on in Dublin. So I just decided to email him and see if he had anything going on. And he happened to have a play called The Park On, which was a part of a collaborations festival in Smock Alley Theatre. And he was willing to let us interview him and shoot the play. So we shot the rehearsals and the play.
okay. So I took the main role as camera operator. We went down one of the days to shoot the rehearsals, and as we'd never really shot anything before, we had quite a few issues with colour and the how bright the video was, because the stage was so dark and then the lights were so strong. So we kept adjusting settings, and it meant that the video was very inconsistent. But luckily we were shooting it again for the actual night. But the only problem with that night was the sound quality, because the audience were so loud that we couldn't use a lot of the sound, and it meant that we had to actually sync up a lot of the cutaways with the audio from the rehearsal in the editing process, which made it much more difficult.
I edited the park interview, and we did, like Cathy was saying, we did have a lot of issues with sound quality, and our biggest problem was matching the footage from the rehearsal matching the footage from the nights of the play with the audio from the rehearsal, because we couldn't use both for each because it just wasn't working properly. So it meant that a lot of it was trial and error, because sometimes they would say it differently. So our cutaways were the biggest thing for us. And then when we shot the actual interview, we had some issues with sound, and that made it difficult in the editing process as well. We had an awful lot of Soundtrack Pro work to do and a lot of colour correction.
Right. So when it comes to the part of sound, unfortunately, we could not use the boom because it picked up too much room noise, and there was a terrible hiss in Smock Alley Theatre that day where we actually had the interview. Because of this, we used the internal camera instead, and it still picked up a bit of the hiss, but we were able to edit it out with Soundtrack Pro noise reduction.
Overall, we were quite happy with the interview. We think that the look of it is very good, and the cutaways work quite well with what he's saying in the interview, and we think that the actual content is interesting to listen to. The only real issue we have is we know that the sound isn't great, but other than that, we were quite happy with it.
If we were to shoot the interview again, we would definitely pick a different interview room, because it was the room sound that really brought down the quality of the audio.
So for our second project, we had a lot of different ideas thrown around. We had various meetings throughout the beginning of the module just to see what we wanted, and we came up with an idea. We wanted to focus on a friendship, and myself and Cathy were at a play in the Helix, and we saw a couple who had Down syndrome, and they were just together, and it kind of just it was nice to see them so independent, because there could be stereotypes and things like that involved with people with Down syndrome, that it was really refreshing to see them. And the fact that we really liked that, we thought that other people would like to see things like that as well. So we talked to Danny and Paul about it, and they liked the idea. So we decided to do an idea of friendships or relationships with two people with Down syndrome. So I got in contact with Down Syndrome Ireland, and they really liked the idea, as they're doing a campaign that's like we are people too, and people like us, things like that, where they're just trying to stress that people with Down syndrome are just like everyone else, and there shouldn't be any stereotypes involved. So they got us in contact with two best friends, Thomas and Katie, and from then on we just contacted them, and we went down to them in Tullamore and shot various locations of them, you know, just in their own environment, because they are best friends and things like that. So it's really nice to see.
Okay, so again, I took the main role as the camera operator in the interviews and for the cutaways. We were limited in that none of us had a car, and there was only 4 of us as well, so it meant that we had to get public transport and we had to carry all the equipment ourselves. So that meant we could only ever really take 2 cameras and a boom at any one time, and that was probably one of our biggest limitations, because we had to do a number of trips down to Tullamore, where Thomas and Katie are from, and these could take time to organise. When we went down there with the interviews, we did them at their houses, and time would probably have been one of the biggest problems that we had, because we only had a number of hours to do it, and we probably underestimated how time consuming the interviews could be with them. In terms of the cutaways, I think the cutaways that we shot were pretty good, and they fit in well with what we're saying, but we had a shortage of them, particularly ones of them simply interacting. We looking back, we should have just filmed them doing more normal things, or even just chatting, because they were the most endearing of the cutaways when we ended up editing.
Yeah, like Cathy was saying, our biggest issue was with the range of cutaways. We spent a day down in Tullamore filming cutaways of greyhounds, because they both have an interest in it and they both have greyhounds. But we spent, looking back, we spent far too long on that, and we have too much footage to cut down for the editing process, whereas we should have spent that time just doing more simple things like them interacting. In terms of the interviews, again, we were stuck for time. We were also quite limited with just the exposure and things like that. Some of for example, Katie's sitting room where we filmed her solo interview, we really didn't have a lot of control over the lighting and things like that. So we had an awful lot of colour correction to do there. I'll give it to you now.
Cool. When it comes to sound, we shot everything with booms. So everything is done with booms except for the interview with the representative of DSI. Unfortunately, on the day, we did in fact have a boom, but we didn't check that the mic was on external, and unfortunately it was on internal. So there is a bit of a difference when it comes to the difference in sounds from that. So everything shot in Tullamore is fine. It is the sound is consistent, but when it comes to that, it is different. We try to fix it as much as possible in Soundtrack Pro, but as you know, there's only so much you can really do when you don't have it. When you made the mistake from the first place.
We shared the editing process, which was very time consuming because we had so much footage. We began we organised a structure for it, which we found quite difficult because we seem to have an awful lot of just different things, and for example, just greyhounds, and we filmed a day at Down Syndrome Ireland Smart Tourism launch. So we really just had to decide on the structure and then stick to that and just pull down the best bits of the best quality video footage. And then I took the main role sort of as chief editor, just tidying it up as we went along. And we found the biggest limitation really was with Thomas's interview. He was quite a difficult subject to interview. So we had to cut an awful lot of what he said, which really created problems with the audio because there's a lot of jumping within it, and transitions didn't work on every part of it. So the sound quality isn't great in that sense, although it is consistent because we used the boom.
Okay, so originally we wanted to go down to Thomas and Katie's house and shoot them interacting one of the days, maybe going bowling, and then the next day get the train up with them to the Down Syndrome Ireland Smart Tourism Guide launch. but unfortunately we couldn't organise it. Thomas and Katie were busy the day before, and the launch was so early in the morning that it just wasn't feasible. It wasn't going to work out. So what ended up happening was we went to the Smart Tourism launch and we filmed that, and then we went down on the train with them and came back up that evening again after they got off. For the journey itself, the train was absolutely packed when we got onto it, and that's actually something we weren't really expecting, and we found it really difficult to find a seat even for Thomas and Katie to sit beside each other, because originally we had wanted them to sit on either side of the table because they had said that they liked to play cards on the train, but we couldn't find that. So we were actually lucky to find 2 seats for them even to sit side by side, and then luckily there was one more seat just opposite the table where I was able to sit, and we had an iPod, and I just filmed them as best as I could then, just playing the cards. I found it quite restrictive filming with the iPod because I wasn't able to zoom, and the train was so shaky that the footage, it's not the best quality, but we decided to keep quite a lot of it in because it was nice to see them just natural. I found that when it was the iPod in front of them, they loosened up quite a bit because it's not as distracting as having a camera in your face. So they kind of forgot that it was there, and they just got really into the game, and it worked really well then when we were editing. The only thing about it is when we were importing it, I don't know if we imported it right, because rendering it, every time we took a clip down, we had to render the train footage, and it took ages. Even the one clip could take 15 minutes to render, and every time you moved it, you'd have to render it again. So it was so time consuming editing the train footage, even though it was very simple editing.
Throughout the entire shooting and interviewing process, we kept in constant contact with Down Syndrome Ireland. We sent him a lot of emails just telling them the questions we were doing, the structure of our documentary, just to make sure that they were happy with everything that we were doing, just as we knew it was a sensitive enough subject in a way, and even just we kept in contact with Thomas and Katie's family as well, just to ensure that everyone was happy with the interviewing process and what we were doing.
In terms of the look of the documentary with regards to colouring and exposure, etc., we were relatively good with it. One of the days that we filmed all the footage outside, the sun kept coming in and out, and we were really worried on the day that this was really going to affect our footage and make a lot of it unusable if it was too much exposure. But I think we dealt with it really well. We did constant white balances on both cameras, and if need be, we would affix the iris to adjust to the different, what word am I looking for? Exposures, yeah. And the outdoors footage actually needed little or no colour correction at all. Actually, I'm not sure if we did any on it. The footage looked really good. It was only the indoor stuff, the actual interviews, that needed any colour correction in the editing process.
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest things that, like Cathy was talking about with the colour, was for the interviews with the 2 different cameras, the colour was slightly inconsistent. So we had to do a lot of colour correction on every single interview clip to match them up, because we had a lot of cuts from wide shot to close up to cover the jumps, because we cut a lot of what they said down. And particularly with Thomas's interview, because he was quite difficult to interview, he got quite frustrated at times. So we would end up, like, one sentence that he would say, it could end up being 8 clips altogether, like pulled together. So we really had to vary the shots to cover the cuts on the timeline. So that meant really spending a lot of time colour correcting to match up the exposure and the look of each shot.
When it came to editing, one of the things that came up was we weren't actually sure how we were going to structure a documentary, in that we knew that we wanted to highlight their friendship and that they're people just like anyone else, but we weren't actually sure how it was going to work in the form of a story. There was one point when we were quite worried that it was just going to be loads of individual sequences that weren't going to link together, and we had to put a lot of thought into how we were going to structure it to tell a story about Thomas and Katie. It meant that a couple of things that we had shot and some of them we actually really liked had to go. Particularly the smart tourism launch had to be edited out as it didn't fit in with the story, even though we had quite a bit of footage for it. Another thing that had to go was we asked them about the romance, any romance that was between them, and even though we were all quite fond of that interview footage, we had no cutaways to go over it, and at that point anyway it was nearing 7 minutes, so we took the decision to edit that out as well.
When it comes to the music of the documentary, I approached one of my friends, Orla Clark, and she's a third year music major in UCC. So I asked her to write and perform and then perform and record and then send us the a track for the music documentary. For the documentary.
Okay. Before we decided on the structure of the documentary, we had sourced the music because we knew that it was going to take a few weeks for Danny's friend to compose and send on to us. And because we hadn't decided the structure, it did change. We kind of went away from some of the more, it was more emotional than we anticipated. I think we had realized that we had decided in the beginning that it was going to be more lighthearted. So when we got the music, it matched some parts of the documentary and it didn't work for others, particularly the more emotional scenes when they're talking about when they're kind of their support for one another when they've lost relatives. So we weren't sure what we were going to do. We thought maybe we might have to source other music, but that was quite we didn't really have an awful lot of time to do that. So we made the decision then to just try and edit the music, and then Danny took it into Pro Tools and slowed it down, and then we found that it worked a lot better for us. One of the things that we would do differently next time is that we didn't really stick to our roles properly. We had set out what our roles would be. Cathy was the main camera operator and Noelle was production manager, Danny was on sound, and I was director. But we did find that we overlapped quite a bit. While Cathy did, she was the main camera operator and we kind of used her camera more so for anything else. The other camera was a backup. On a lot of the days, myself, Danny and Noelle would share doing second camera, and Noelle and Danny shared the sound for a lot of it as well. So I think the mistakes that we made, particularly with sound, they could have been avoided if we had one person stuck with sound and that was their sole responsibility and they weren't thinking about other things. It probably would have worked better for us.
Looking back on our project, although we are happy with how it turned out, we do feel that we were quite ambitious with the subject matter, doing it on 2 people with Down syndrome. It's the kind of interview topic that really requires weeks upon weeks of footage because we needed them so natural and comfortable with the camera and around us that wasn't the case with the limited time that we had. We did spend a number of days of full footage shooting with them, but it wasn't enough. And particularly with the interviews, we find that particularly Thomas, he put himself under a lot of pressure. He'd rehearsed his answers off, and we could see that he was getting relatively distressed if he wasn't able to remember his answers. We found particularly when we were interviewing, for example, May, how much easier it was to interview her compared with Thomas and Katie. And we just think that it was, for a first project, it was quite a difficult subject matter to take on and to take on well.